Hello and welcome back to another update as we cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. We start out in Bakhmut direction where the Russian forces have made advances in three different directions. In the northern flank they've managed to capture the rest of the trenches here in the Homova road. With this there's going to be a lot more advances coming in this direction, as the Russian forces have managed to capture the strongest parts in this direction. We see that the Ukrainian forces held trenches that goes through these northern parts to the south of these areas, filled with trenches, trench networks, and so on, in this whole area, going throughout the multiple layers of trenches, really. And all of these forest lines and so on, with the Russian forces have now managed to capture pretty much all of them. There may be a few left here in the southwestern direction, but pretty much all of them. And the furthest the Russian forces have managed to reach here in the Homova direction has been passed over with these recent advances in the car racing track, and now here to the west of the nursery farms area. In the Bakhmut area, the Russians used to hold a foothold at the outskirts, so there's still these advances here left before they returned to their widest area of control. But it seems that the Russian forces have passed what they held prior to the Ukrainian counterattack, which started on May 20th after the Russian capture of Bakhmut. We have seen consistent Russian advances in this direction since the end of the Ukrainian offensive, and now they've managed to advance in the Dasha area yet again after the previous three advances, first on the 5th of December, the 6th of December, the 13th, and now the 19th. Or the 18th, as it happened yesterday. The recent Russian advances in this direction has allowed them to capture most of the Dacha area with this small part left. With these advances, we see that the Russian forces are looking to get control over the remaining parts of the Dacha area before pushing westwards in the direction of Ivanivske. We see that the Ukrainian forces have fortifications and defensive positions here to the northeast of the village of Ivanivske, with the forest lines acting as geographical barriers combined with the rivers. We see that the Ukrainian forces have some positions here in the north. However, the Russian forces are now able to advance from two different directions, from the east and the northeast, if their advances in the Dasha area continues. And with the advances in the north as well, there could be some operations from this direction. So Ivanivske is becoming more and more in danger as the Russian advances continue. To mention the northern flank, we then move on to the southern flank, where the Russian forces have managed to re-enter Klishivka after they were pushed out over a month ago. The Russian forces are continuing their operations in this direction, trying to regain control over Klishivka and push the Ukrainian forces out. So we're seeing that the situation here in the west of Bakhmut is rapidly deteriorating for the Ukrainian forces ever since their offensive ended. The Ukrainian forces are now facing off against a Russian offensive that is pushing them back beyond what they held and is threatening their positions to the east of the canal. If this current rate of advances continue, we'll see that the Ukrainian forces' defenses in this area may collapse as the Russian forces continue pushing their positions. We see something that adds up to this in this video here, which was recorded by a drone that shows Russian soldiers, multiple squads advancing at the same time. Deep State map, as biased as it is, called it human wave tactics, when in reality this is pretty much how any modern military would use infantry. We see in the video groups of Russian soldiers spread far apart in squad formations, and following up there are less distance between the soldiers, but we do see multiple squads, actually 4 on the video, which adds up to beyond 20 soldiers, and them being able to just move freely essentially through these Dacha areas shows that the Ukrainian forces have either completely withdrawn from the area or that they have simply run out of artillery for this section. We see in the continuation of the video, which I can't show due to YouTube guidelines, that the Russian forces actually engage in combat with Ukrainian forces in trenches and defensive positions throughout the Dacha area. So this crosses out the first possibility that they have simply withdrawn. This means that the Ukrainian forces are in a severe lack of artillery at the front line, considering that the Russians are allowed to just move through the fields with their infantry. We then move on to the Novomykhailivka direction, where the Russian forces have made yet another advancement here to the south of the city. With this, they cover almost the entire length of the city in the southern flank. The Russian forces will likely continue to capture the final patches of forest here to the west before moving in and onto Novomykhailivka. The Russian forces know that the eastern parts is an area where they can storm with the armored vehicles due to how narrow the eastern flank is. However, they have faced difficulties getting a foothold within the city, as the Ukrainian forces were able to stop both advancements, both to the southeast here in the intersection and to the northeast in this direction. Both of these advancements were failed, as the Ukrainian forces were able to hold them back. Since then, we have seen the advancements here to the south, where they are trying to change up their strategy, similar to how the Ukrainians did, with smaller groups to then widen the front. And with the wider front, the Ukrainian forces also have to split up their defenses so they can't defend all in one place, which will allow the Russian forces to concentrate their forces in one direction to try and break through, with less Ukrainian forces defending against their positions. Depending on how much information they are and how rapidly they can redeploy, there's also the question of how many assault groups can Russian forces focus in one place at the same time. What is the importance of Novomykhailivka? Why are the Russian forces pressuring this city for multiple weeks, if not months now? That is because to the south of Marinka, after the capture of the city, the Russian forces are able to relocate more forces. This is why we have seen advancements here in the southern direction. There's also the concentration of Russian forces in this whole direction have been fairly unused through the Ukrainian offensive, as the Ukrainian forces didn't really launch any offensive operations in this direction. Then there's also the fact that Uledar has been impenetrable by the Ukrainian forces, have been able to defend it heavily despite all of the Russian attempts. One of the main reasons for this is their northern supply line. The Russian forces have faced difficulties trying to break through the fields here to the east, as they are in the open area and vulnerable to Ukrainian artillery and anti-tank weaponry. So they have attempted to attack from the east as well, but that has failed as well. So this is the new attempt at Uledar. By capturing Novomykhailivka, pushing westwards, they can cut off the supplies from this important cornerstone here by Konstantinivka. If Konstantinivka is lost to the Russian forces, then they can launch multiple offensives and attacks towards Uledar, which will eventually run out of supplies and fall due to the lack of supply lines going to and from the city. The Russian forces have Pavlivka, which cuts off the southern supply route. Then there are smaller roads that go through to the north, but these are very limited. If the Russian forces launch attacks from Novomykhailivka to Konstantinivka, capture Konstantinivka, they can move either southwards, westwards, or northern direction to go around Uledar and attack Vodiane in the north, which would also cut off the supplies completely. Either way, they could have artillery positions and direct fire positions towards the supply lines here, but with the limited amount of possibilities for the Ukrainian forces to send reinforcements and to actually deal with the Russian capture here to try and counterattack to recapture it, they would drain up the Ukrainian forces in the area. It seems that the Russian strategy generally since the Battle of Bakhmut really has been to drain down the Ukrainian forces. Compared to the start where they wanted to capture the country, they then moved on to defensive positions, withdrawing from the front, and areas were difficult to defend due to the lack of manpower to hold all of the territories they held. But since they started mobilizing forces, since they started adding a ton of volunteers really, they have been fully committed to draining down the Ukrainian forces. This is why we're seeing here in the Battle of Krinky, the Ukrainian forces managed to gain a foothold. They've held this for months, yet the Russian forces were unable to recapture it after a lot of losses and a lot of fighting in this direction, as the Ukrainian forces storming the eastern bank of Dnipro River fear their mission is hopeless. We see that the Russian forces have yet again advanced in the direction of the village and have managed to capture more territory. The Ukrainian soldiers talking about the storming here to the east of the Dnipro River, they claim that their mission is very difficult due to mortars are the first thing that greet the Ukrainian soldiers who are lucky enough to make it across the Dnipro River alive. This sentence in and of itself shows how desperate the situation is. First off, they cross the river with their motorboats. That is easy to detect, and they are hit by Russian artillery, Russian air force, and other Russian units attacking them when they're trying to cross the river. Some of them do make it across alive, but then they're instantly hit with mortar shots. No matter how sneaky the Ukrainian small units try to be, it's not hard for the Russian forces holding the eastern bank to see them coming. Russian drones are always on the hunt, boat mortars are loud, and suitable troop landing spots are few. Once Ukrainians are spotted, the Russian either chase them with first-person view FPV drones or drop mortars on them. Bodies lost to the river are nearly impossible to retrieve, the soldiers say. Making it across is just the beginning. Plodding hundreds of meters through marsh and knee-high water with no cover from motors, artillery, tanks, drones, and aircraft is almost as scary. The Ukrainian soldiers maintain distance from each other so at least one of them survives to call in an evacuation. All these risks are in service to what the soldiers call a small, high-stake operation to probe the Russian fortifications on the eastern bank of Ukraine's biggest river, around a kilometer wide in its southern parts, flowing through the Kherson Oblast. We have returned to the probing operation that happened at the start of the Ukrainian offensive. Honestly, at this point, it is just a waste of life, and as Putin said, it is a PR operation if anything else. Just looking at how these operations are taking place, how difficult it is for them, how can they do it in large scale if they're failing so hard doing it in small scales? This is very difficult for them to perform, yet they continue to do so for quote-unquote probing attacks. And as we saw with the probing attacks in the Ukrainian offensive in the Zaporizhia front, they don't really get them that far. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.